As many as 30% of students food insecure. It's been highlighted as a hidden hunger crisis, but why must things first get to crisis mode before anything is done about it? Let's try shed some light on this matter with Dr. Stephen Devereux from the National Research Foundation, and he joins us from our Cape Town studios, while here in Johannesburg we have Ahmed Bauer, who is a CEO or the CEO of Universities South Africa. Dr. Devereux, let's start off with you out in Cape Town. Just how dire is the situation for some of these students?
Good evening. Just a correction, I'm actually with the Centre of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape. Yes, you're quite right to say that students are more food insecure than the general population. It's quite a surprising fact. But over 30% of students are estimated to be food insecure at several universities that have, where research has been done. And the average level of food insecurity in South Africa is around 25, 26%. So this means that students, because they are in a very vulnerable phase of their life, obviously they've left home, but they haven't started working yet, they're having to make do with cutting back on food consumption and rationing and borrowing and so on to survive. It was interesting to hear the President talk about food security earlier on today in Parliament. Now, I don't think people think about students in the context of food insecurity, but clearly this is a hidden hunger problem that needs to be urgently addressed.
It's not a new phenomenon, as you say as well. Why are we only making it a priority now?
It's not new, and actually it's not just confined to South Africa. If you look at the United States, for example, or even Australia, studies that have been done there have also found that students tend to be more food insecure than the general population. And it obviously depends on the background that students come from. So in the US, students from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to be more likely to be food insecure. And of course, that's the same here. So at one university, they found that white students, about 25% of white students were food insecure, which is less than the national average. But as many as 75 to 80% of black students or African students were food insecure. So this clearly shows that the background that people come from is part of the problem. And with high levels of poverty, over 50%, with unemployment being at 27%, with malnutrition among children being 27% as well, it's perhaps not surprising that the distribution of hunger in students reflects the distribution of poverty and inequality in South Africa as a whole.
Yeah, what about political will? Do you see that coming to the fore? You did speak about President Cyril Ramaphosa making mention of it, but is there sufficient political will in this regard?
I think that food security is becoming a national issue. We're starting to think a lot about food security a lot in the context of land, of course, and farming and agriculture. But the problem is as much to do with access to food, and that has to do more with income. So when you talk about vulnerable groups, it's people that don't have access to income to buy the food that they need. And that's where students obviously become a priority group. So where do students get money from? If they don't have their own resources or their family money, they have to borrow, or they get loans from NSFAS or bursaries. And if those loans and bursaries aren't sufficient, then of course they're going to go hungry. And of course, if those loans and bursaries don't come on time, that's another problem. And that's a big problem with NSFAS at the moment.
Yeah. Mr. Bauer, let's get into your conversation as well here. Has enough thought been put behind how exactly to solve such issues?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about raising the issue about how long the problem has been running. And it's not just the last year or 2 years, it's the last 15 years.
Highlighted now, but
it's been going on for years and years. And at the historically black universities and at the University of Technology, it's been an ongoing issue. So at the beginning of every year, it's an issue. So in some senses, I think you asked about political will, and I want to just say that I think that with the new minister, with the Minister Naledi Pandor in place now, she's taken really decisive steps, and we think that those steps will really help us to do two things. The one is to kind of manage the situation for this year and next year. But what she's also doing, we understand, is putting in place a fairly major review of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme.
Sure.
So the system, it's not about fixing the system. It's about really reconceptualizing, redesigning the system so that it works well in the future.
Is placing an administrator in charge going to help the situation?
I don't think she had much choice, because unfortunately the current leadership of the organization just wasn't in a position to solve the problems.
Yeah.
And so they've taken this decisive step of disbanding the board and then instituting what is within her right, by the way, in terms of the Higher Education Act.
So much at play, however. We were dealing with the matter of fees not so long ago. We obviously have this issue, which in itself has been continuing for the longest time, as we continue to say. The pressure on schools to be able, or universities to afford this, on government to play its role, on communities to perhaps add a part as well. Do you see that collaboration being effected?
Look, there's always been collaboration, but the problem is that the model just was the wrong model. The model was really drawn from the British model, which was where, young students went to university, they had a little bank account, their parents were putting £50 into...
a little too modern maybe for us.
And just not the right model.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges this was faced this year, of course, was the introduction of the new system that was introduced on the 16th of December last year.
Yeah.
There just wasn't enough time really to galvanize kind of the implementation of a new system.
Yeah.
Having said that, that's not the major problem. The major problem is really the need for us to sit down and together, all the different parties, together kind of redesigning the system.
Let's bring Dr. Devereux back into the conversation now as well. Dr. Devereux, your research showing, as you said earlier, 30% of students perhaps at the very least food insecure. How exactly then do we solve the problem? We've just said that the system in itself right now was perhaps just not the right system for South Africa. What system should we perhaps have in place, you reckon?
I do think that a rethink of university financing is urgently needed. But I'd also like to draw attention to the fact that universities themselves are doing a lot to try and address this problem. And if you look around the country, you'll find that almost every university has got some kind of scheme in place to assist their neediest students. Many universities are running food banks now, or food pantries, where students can get food if they're really desperate. In the Free State, Professor Janssen started this No Student Hungry campaign, which actually gives extra money, 30 Rand a day, I think, to students so they can buy food on campus. At the University of the Western Cape, where I'm based, many faculties are raising money for their own students. So in a sense, academics are taking responsibility for feeding their students and helping them meet their basic needs for groceries, for transport, and so on. There's even a very interesting and innovative web page that's been created by a student at UWC who saw how her fellow students were struggling, and she set up this page called the Fairy Godmother. And if you have a problem, a real crisis with money, you can write to that page and somebody can donate money to help you solve your problem. But the question really is, how sustainable are these initiatives? They're very ad hoc. They are not fully funded. Of course, they don't meet everybody's needs. And they also, in a sense, replicate the existing inequalities, because the better off universities can provide better support to their students. The historically disadvantaged universities provide less support. So this isn't really going to solve the problem of dropouts, and we have a high number of dropouts, and it's quite clear that the dropouts are related to food insecurity and poverty among the students.
So what are you suggesting then, Doctor?
Students who are more likely to drop out, and we're not going to get radical transformation of South Africa's economy and society unless we have more black graduates.
So what are you suggesting we do then in this case?
Well, firstly, NSFAS definitely has to get more efficiently managed. It's already August, and we know that many students haven't yet got their bursaries for this year. How are they surviving? Secondly, the bursaries are quite small, especially the food and basic living costs component. I know, for example, that at one university, the students get 4,000 Rand a year to live on, and that's just over 10 Rand a day. Who can live on 10 Rand a day? Sometimes they get this in the form of a voucher for a supermarket like Pick n Pay. They have to travel to Pick n Pay and come back again. So I'm just wondering whether this is the appropriate way to deal with this issue. Maybe we should go back to the model where universities provide dining halls, and if you're a student and you have a bursary, you have free access to the dining hall and your meals are provided, and you don't have to worry about paying for food or going to the shops or getting vouchers to go and get your food. Yeah. It's there in the residence, in the hostel.
Mr. Bauer, your sentiments on that?
I think the first challenge of the administrator now is to really get the money out to the students. And even if it means taking certain levels of risk and so on in terms of who's getting the money, that money needs to get out, and students have to be in the position where they can buckle down and start studying again and be food secure and so on.
Can NSFAS still get back to helping students in the way it should?
Well, I don't believe that. I mean, I think that what we have to do is we have to think about a solution for this year.
Yeah.
Which is saying, how do we kind of deal with the students who have not yet received their monies, who have only received a partial amount of their...
Sure. And I mean, applications for next year are still closed.
It's exactly right. So the first challenge is really to get the money out.
Yeah.
And by the way, a part of that is what Mr. Devereux kind of suggested was the fact that universities are still waiting for tremendous amounts of money from NSFAS as well, which haven't yet been paid over to the universities. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge, of course, is to have a fairly decent kind of start to the 2019 academic year, getting applications in and processing those applications. But working very closely with the universities, because that is the challenge. You know, up to now, NSFAS has seen universities as something out there. There hasn't been sufficient collaboration and so on. So there has to be much more collaboration between the universities and NSFAS. And by the way, we've been trying to encourage NSFAS to do that.
Yeah.
And the third thing, of course, as I mentioned right at the beginning, was this idea that we really have to think about redesigning the system. Mr. Devereux is completely correct. I mean, the current system is simply not working. And that, it's a very simple thing, really. You know, all we should be doing is saying, when a student is admitted to university, that student should be allocated the bursary. That's it. Yeah. You know, there's no rocket science involved here.
Yeah. Mr. Devereux, let's talk about it. The long-term nature, again, just a final word from you. The long-term nature of this is, it really tells you that it's going to take a while to really curb the issue and put it to bed. Can we do enough in the interim, however, to stem the little holes that are there at the very least?
Well, I certainly agree with the professor that management of NSFAS is a major priority that has to be sorted out as quickly as possible. But maybe what's needed is a high-level panel to look at this and bring together all the stakeholders, which means the university administrations, the student representatives, and NSFAS themselves, and the private sector, who also have a role to play. And not to forget the NGOs. I mean, it's quite a shocking fact to realize that Gift of the Givers is feeding students at UKZN, and Stop Hunger Now, South Africa, is feeding students at the University of Johannesburg. So NGOs are feeding students. So all these actors together should sit down and think about who is responsible for this problem and for solving it, and to find ways together that they can work in a partnership to reduce this problem and eradicate it as soon as possible. It's totally unacceptable that students are going hungry in South Africa in 2018.
Yeah. Mr. Bauer, more accountability then is the message.
I think more accountability, but also redesign. I mean, kind of really designing the system, just really saying, you know, how do you design a system with the initial step of placing students at the center, saying, how do you design a system that supports students? Yeah? And, Mr. Devereux mentioned this, and we all know this, by the way, that food insecure students or financially insecure students don't perform as well as students who are financially secure.
Yeah. Professor Ahmed Bauer is the CEO of University South Africa, and Dr. Devereux is the research chair with the South African National Research Foundation.